Hey everyone, this is Nick from the Botch Pit, and today we're going to be talking about a source book called Chronicles of Darkness, Hurt Locker for, you guessed it, the Chronicles of Darkness. At this time, I would like to note that this is the third and final entry of 3 broadcasts regarding weaponry in the World of Darkness. The first being World of Darkness Armory, and the second being World of Darkness Armory Reloaded. Each one highlights weaponry in different ways, and it wasn't fitting to combine them all into one video. However, when all of them are put together in order, it gives a greater bird's eye view of the entire subject matter, as well as additional ideas that can be implemented. The Chronicles of Darkness is a game of modern horror, and the storytelling system is meant to emphasize that horror. Pain, injury, and death are all strong elements of horror, and to be realistic about it, most of the times that we hear these words in our game, we also associate it with the term combat. However, what Hurt Locker does is it disassociates that terminology and makes the storyteller and the players focus more on the term violence instead. Hurt Locker looks at violence from a very specific viewpoint in order to provide a very useful tool for your story. And this violence isn't always direct physical violence. Social, psychological, or even emotional violence is a very large issue in stories that don't really get much attention in the typical game rules. What this book tries to do is touch on these ideas and show ways to present them in your chronicles. Hurt Locker is a spiritual successor to both Armory and Armory Reloaded, as each of them approach violence in their own ways. Instead of repeating the same information over for Chronicles of Darkness, what this book does is it tries to take a different direction, or even think of more of the aftermath of what happens in violent situations. This book is divided into 4 chapters as well as 2 appendices. The first chapter, called Fields of Hurt, start by addressing storytelling and how to frame it within your chronicle. The second chapter, Instruments of Violence, offer character options such as merits, tilts, and rules for lasting trauma, and how to use non-standard skills in a fight. Chapter 3, The Other Side, talks about the supernatural side of the World of Darkness, including new character options, templates, and supernatural merits. The final chapter, Tokyo, brings together some of the rules and ideas that have been presented thus far and frame them within the setting backdrop of Tokyo. As for the appendices, the first one, Equipment, offers ideas and rules for equipment that isn't just weapons, but also new tools and gadgets to add to your chronicle. The second appendice, Conditions, closes out the book with a list of conditions for ease of reference during gameplay. Although this appendice for equipment exists that includes weaponry, if you're looking for swaths of weapons and equipment traits, that's not really in this book. Again, where you would want to find that is in Armory as well as Armory Reloaded. It is extremely easy to convert these first edition rules to their second edition counterparts. Simply subtract 1 from the damage rating and use the size as the strength requirement. Also, in second edition, all weapons cause lethal damage, so ignore the bashing designators. Keep in mind though that this may not be perfect, and again, this is something that you need to discuss with your storyteller in terms of implementation, as with any rules that you decide to do, because it's really all up to them how they want to handle this, although this is a pretty good guideline to go by when first starting it. Chapter 1, Stories of Violence, details how to go about bringing violence tastefully into your chronicle by maintaining integrity and value within it without overusing and abusing it. It first discusses how to use storytelling techniques to make violence hurt, then goes into scene contextualization, and finally closes with discussing different violence groups. Before we get pretty deep into this, I want to make a point to acknowledge that not all players are going to be comfortable with what happens, and at the end of the day, you ought to make the game enjoyable for them. If players are being continually upset with what's going on, it may be a good idea to dial back a little bit. When it comes to storytelling with violence, storytellers ought to study their players. Find out through sensory storytelling what makes them wince and squirm. Write these things down because that affected the player, and be sure to bring it up again in a later scene, whether it's the next session or a session 10 weeks from now. It mattered to them, and they showed you their hand. Use it. In terms of pop culture, think Jaws. Whereas when we're first introduced to the shark, we're not even really introduced to the shark. We're introduced to an incredibly violent scene that is then cued by the music that this creature has that comes with it. Now, in the first half of the movie, we hear this theme, however, we still don't see the shark and we still see violent actions associated with them. one of the scariest moments in all of cinema occurs when Martin Brody is throwing Chum off the side of the boat and the shark appears. But that was the first time we've actually seen the shark as the audience. However, the musical cue is missing, and that caused terror. These little phrases, these little cues, in the absence of violence that had inflicted a violent act, is what keeps players on their toes and makes them on edge even in the absence of any violent act. An example from the Botch Pit storylines that we tell is a simple phrase. Whether this character occurs or not, strikes fear into, I guarantee, every single person that's playing. And the simple phrase is circles and patterns. Out of context, not scary at all. In context, when you know who this is associated with, the engineer, it's pretty terrifying, but the best part of it is it doesn't affect just one person. The entire table winces whenever those words are uttered. The reason is because of all the prior violent acts associated with this character before he says this term. In the absence of the character, those words are just as powerful as those violent acts. And you remember them even if you don't think you're going to remember them. Storytelling games are all about choices and consequences. Don't define protagonists by what happens to them, but what they do about it. Likewise, there's no evil chronicle in Chronicles of Darkness. We're telling stories about individuals who make their own choices and who have complex relationships. If your character was polar to either of these two positions, good and evil, they would make for an incredibly boring and flat character. And Chronicles favors exploration of the human condition, and the good or evil designators robs everyone at the table from doing individual actions and implementing individual variables. High integrity doesn't mean a person does only good things, while likewise, a low integrity person only does bad things. People are complicated, and whatever they do to get through life has to be explored individually. This same ideal of good and evil, victims and victimizers, although I don't like to use these words in Chronicles, carries over beyond mortal game lines to the supernatural core lines as well. No matter which book you play, Hurt Locker can help define what hurts, because, spoilers, everyone hurts and experiences violence whether they are human or not. Changeling the Lost, for example, is a game which heavily relies on a metaphor for abuse and trauma. Changeling are people whose autonomy was removed, and they seized it back, leaving them damaged and dealing. Some wounds never truly heal, and the Lost understand this more than anyone. This all being said, let's take a look at lasting harm in Chronicles of Darkness with two of the Botch Pit's characters, Devin and Val. Devin, Brad's Geist character, could be seen as the story of moving on. So a quick summary of what happened. Trevor and Devin were trapped by the engineer, and what happened was Devin was forced to kill Trevor. And although Trevor was saying, keep doing it, it affected Devin as a character for what he had to do. Imagine having to actually go through and do it in sort of this jigsaw type trap where he had to kill one of his, up until that time, closest allies after experiencing the death of a previous character the session, I believe, before. This was a session that I didn't attend, but I've just seen from how the entire pit has discussed this session, as well as the pictures of how much it affected Brad as a person going through this. And even though Trevor is a storytelling character, he really is Chris's character. It's one of his newest ones. However, Brad also knew that Chris really liked this character, and that's what kind of made it even harder for him. And in the end, what happened was the next session it was revealed that Trevor is a Geist, Brad's character, Devin, is now a Geist, and it's all well and good. However, Trevor kept constantly reminding him, hey, you killed me, which for Brad still affected him as a player, but also he played it out really, really well. For the next few sessions, he played it out, and he played it out well. And you can tell whenever that situation comes up in the future, whether Trevor makes an off comment or something like that, it affects Devin incredibly. Now comes the second character, Val, the story of not moving on. And you can really tell when the storyteller did a good job that even you're taking this out of the context it was in and you're trying to teach us academically like we're doing right now, it's still hurting really, really bad whenever I talk about this. So what happened to Val? Or should I say, what didn't happen to Val and then happened to Val was much like the scenario Devin was put in, where he had to kill Trevor. Val made a mistake, and the choice was even put on her. So given this out of context, what happened was Chris threw two of his most favorite characters at this other big bad, the newest big bad, Erlene, in order to save my character. And even though the choice wasn't put on me, the fact that these two other hunter characters, these two that my character sort of looked up to because everyone else was a supernatural, these were the only two regular humans, sacrificed themselves, immediately died in a single dice roll. And the fact that cumulatively Chris lost about 40 years of storytelling because of your mistake, you can feel, even in the tone of my voice, how that still makes me feel, even though immediately when it happened, which I believe you can still go listen to, is session 18. It's like the session that no one talks about, He Who Shall Not Be Named. It is, at that time, it was such a shock to have anything like that happen to me as a player, combined with like within the next 10 minutes, I got myself killed. So Chris's sacrifice was completely in vain. I instantly broke down about myself. Then Chris was breaking down about what happened to his characters. And we're not even going to touch upon what Chris went through after the game ended when we all left and Brad had to stay behind and kind of make sure that Chris was going to be okay. It was so powerful that we actually stopped playing Chronicles for an incredibly long time. And since then, we've only ever played one other session with these characters. Even though it's been about 6 months since we played that session, and although we had that other session in between, there was never any closure. And the best way to describe this character in terms of this failure of this magnitude is whenever, well, in that previous session when I went to go play her again, it feels like you're consistently drowning, if that makes sense. Nothing you can ever do is right, and this failure will be over your head. She hasn't moved on yet. And it's partially because of the way that I feel like I acted when it all came down. I didn't consider anyone else's feelings. But also, it's tough to accept that you were the reason, whether it was storytelling, doing their own discretion, or otherwise. You were the sole reason this happened. And that's a very hard thing to swallow, that you failed. And it's one of those lasting effects of, how trauma, and it's not even to yourself, even though, you got yourself killed, can affect a character. And even though in the following session, session 19, he brought Random back as a Geist, it didn't really do much because of the amount of time that had passed, and also the reminder again that it exists. So how do you storytell something like this? The pro tip is that you can't. It's the players who obsess over this and make this happen. Well, you could, consistently remind them how you single-handedly destroyed two of their most precious characters that they've had over the past 20 years, and it keeps being running your head every week, and he always calls you and tells you that, hey, those two characters I really loved, you killed them. Even though it's been 6 months that you've actually gone to play the game, and you can't even take it up again because you feel like you're consistently drowning every time you touch this character. But I digress. For me, this is the chapter that defines this book and what makes it a must-have. Framing scenes is also listed in the section to help you as a storyteller on how to handle certain situations within your story to add drama, suspense, and so on. It also lists ways the story plays out, whether dice rolls are successes or failures. Finally, some example violence group concepts come into play here as well. The first is a group known as Precinct 44, whose concepts are corrupt police, containing police officers and detectives. The second is Nation of the Divine, whose concepts reflect religious extremists with ministers and soldiers of faith. Thirdly is the Seventh Sharp, who are bored middle-class kids joining gangs that break into gangbangers, or one of seven. And finally exists the Nameless, which is an internet hate group. The next chapter, Instruments of Violence, addresses more primarily mortal character options to choose. The first part is dedicated to new general merits, that deal with violence and how to include them into your game. The next major section has to do with an intense treatment and rework of fighting style merits. Now, if you've been following this guide up until this point, you realize that there has been the initial ones placed in Armory, the rework in Armory Reloaded. In Chronicles of Darkness, they reworked them again, making this the fourth rework of fighting style merits, as far as I am aware. So before I get into it, you can kind of see how confusing this can be, and some storytellers, depending on what they want to do, might just ignore this altogether and allow you to do whatever you want. However, if you're going to follow the book, I'll explain what's going to happen. If you're coming from Armory Reloaded, it's very, very similar, as in you have to have a background that fits the character that allows you to use these merits. And also, when stacking fighting merits, you can sometimes perform them, however, you need to meet certain requirements to do it, such as, can you explain how you're able to do it? Is all your equipment there? You can't stack fighting merits that penalize one of your character's traits more than once or impose the same disadvantage more than once. You can't stack maneuvers that use different dice pools unless changing the dice pools to benefit the merit specifically confers. And when stacked maneuvers provide the same benefit, the higher of the two apply. And to note, when the two maneuvers provide the same result by different means, they do stack. So the rope benefit, rerolled failed dice, does stack with bonus dice. The major difference in these rules as opposed to all the other rules is the addition of style tags. These define a merit's basic category, how it functions, and most importantly, its relationship with similar merits. These are archery, attitude, creature, flexible, grappling, heavy melee, light melee, movement, pistol, pole weapons, rifle, striking, and tactical. And some of these include keywords which further define what they're used for. Now, this can be incredibly confusing, and I understand that. So I tried to find an analogy that could probably help out a whole bunch of people in terms of figuring out what is a style merit and how does it actually function. So, very abstractly, if you've ever played a Pokemon game, there are different types of Pokemon, such as fire, grass, water, electric, and so on. I know I'm kind of stretching it with this analogy, but just hear me out. When you link style merits, you have to think of yourself as the gym leaders of the Pokemon universe, where you specialize in one type. For example, Brock, the first gym leader, specializes in rock type. Same idea. You want to specialize in one type of style, for example, movement, and use only other merits that list movement as a style tag to fit with your party. And although you can get other Pokemon that have dual typings, such as rock and water, you need to at least have something that has rock in it to fit with your character and the way these style tags work. For example, the weapon and shield merit has the style tag of light melee. With thrown weapons, you have the style tags of light melee and agile. You can use these both together because they both have the style tag light melee. In addition to styles, they also list individual merits that help bolster these styles as well. The next section is all about lasting trauma, and although we discussed this a little before in terms of psychological and social and all that stuff, what happens in this section is you can give them conditions such as arm disability, chronic agony, chronic sickness, and so on to help further define a character depending on what has happened to them. And finally, this section also offers ways additional skills besides brawl, firearms, and weaponry play in violent situations. Chapter 3, The Other Side, is dedicated to supernatural merits of human characters. What do I mean by this? Psychics, thaumaturges, and the like from books such as Second Sight and the Chronicles core book play a part here. Your character is required to remain human to use these merits, and if he or she ever changes to a different supernatural character type, these abilities are lost. As per the sanctity of merits, these dots can be reallocated. What else being offered in this section is a new idea of what is called a micro template. So just to recap the idea of lesser templates and greater templates and so on, what a individual starts out as, a character, always exists as a mortal template. And then what happens is you apply these different templates depending on what they turn into. So for example, our mortal template of a normal human could turn into a lesser template, such as Second Sight, or a template such as 100 the Vigil, which is the only core book that is a lesser template. And then what could happen to that character is that they could have eventually evolved into a greater template, such as Mage, such as Werewolf, such as Vampire, and so on. And also to note, I'm not saying that they have to go through the lesser template, but you could do that for story purposes. Eventually, you have just a mortal character and then what they turn into. In Hurt Locker exists 6 micro templates, and micro templates serve as a bridge that exists halfway between a mortal template and a lesser template. So on that scale, it would be mortal, micro template, lesser template, and greater template. Micro templates are defined by a series of related supernatural merits that make these mortal and human characters into something a little bit more, but not quite reaching those lesser templates. The first is the Ataria, who are incredibly lucky people that are blessed by some sort of fate. Things that might go sour for most people end up being favorable for these people. To create an Ataria, a character must have 1 dot in the damn lucky merit and have a place that they constantly honor, where luck flows. The next set is called the Dreamers, which are sleeper agents that somehow have had a mission put into their heads that they don't remember happening. All Dreamers receive a single dot in the subliminal conditioning merit for free. In addition to this, a mission has to be defined by the storyteller on what went down. However, it's not completely revealed to the Dreamer until time has passed. The next micro-template, the Infected, is exactly how it sounds. These are people that have had some sort of infection within them, and depending on the severity of it, could grow into something completely monstrous. All infected players begin with the latent symptoms persistent condition and the dot of the carrier merit. The Plane, which is the 4th micro-template, are radical pacifists who put their body in harm's way in order to prove points. All Plane characters have the Plane Reader merit, which is a block that deeply influences your character. The Lost Boys are former military operatives that have been discharged to live relatively normal lives. However, when they were in military service, they were given augmentations and other assorted serums by the Delta Protocol. And the Lost Boys feel that even after they left military service, they could not really live in peace. They were always looking over their shoulder, always figuring that the Delta Protocol, even a name that someone saw in some bizarre document that they believe was part of this, the name stuck. Is speculative, but some people swear that it exists and that they're preparing for something to be coming in the near future. Lost Boys receive 1 free dot of the protocol merit. They suffer withdrawal symptoms when without the protocol's special serum. The last template is more of a phenomenon versus a group. What they are psychic vampires, which take the vital essence and force of will from their victims. Typically, psychic vampires learn their condition when they're quite benign, as in she causes fatigue and minor illness in her victims, but as time increases and she increases her power, they become more and more dangerous. Psychic vampires receive their signature merit, Psychic Vampirism, with a single dot for free. If the vampirism is tied to a relic or something that can be taken away from them, additional merits can be allocated for free. If you've read any of the other Chronicles of Darkness games, you may have noticed that Tokyo sections appear in most of them. Vampire the Requiem, Werewolf the Forsaken, Mage the Awakening, Promethean the Created, Changeling the Lost, and Beast the Primordial currently have Tokyo treatments in all of them. Each addresses Tokyo from that specific game line's interests, and each builds into a more cohesive meta setting. The section in Hurt Locker addresses parts of Tokyo from a human standpoint, or at least humans who have seen past the veil into the dark truths of the world. If this is a setting that you're looking to use or are currently using, I would definitely give it a read to kind of give additional ideas to what you could potentially do. As for Appendix 1, the main draw for me was that they laid out charts for what each firearm could potentially do in Chronicles. However, as even mentioned by the book itself, you really want to use Armory and Armory Reloaded to come up with the sheer mass of weapons that you could use these rules with. And for Appendix 2, it's just a really nice list of conditions that your character could potentially have depending on the violent situations they are placed in. Again, it's a really nice guide to be able to flip through on the fly. In totality, this concludes not only our broadcast on Hurt Locker, but currently all of our broadcasts on weaponry in general for the World of Darkness. We hope that you're not only able to survive a little bit longer in the World of Darkness, but also give you creative ideas of what can be accomplished in the World of Darkness to survive. And also, unfortunately, the violent aftermath of any of this when it comes to getting hurt. This has been Nick from the Botch Pit. Thank you.